Okay, it's noon. Welcome everybody to the committee of whole meeting for March the 10th, 2025. We acknowledge traditional territory of our friends and neighbors of the Prophet River and Fort Nelson First Nations. We acknowledge our common treaty rights, and we celebrate the contributions and enduring presence of the Métis people in our region. Please be advised that this afternoon's meeting is available for the public to attend virtually, is being streamed and recorded. Councilor, are there any additions? Seeing none, staff, any additions? Thank you. Is there any public who wish to comment online? No? Okay, everybody's okay with the agenda. That brings us to the reports 5.1, which is governmental transfers program update. I'll turn this over to staff, please. Welcome, Ms. Pike.
Hello. How close do I have to be to this? Okay, perfect. We wanted to bring forward an opportunity to have a conversation and a refresher for both staff and council on where we're sitting with the government transfer policy and guidelines. So Jay and I are going to tag team this today, but we basically wanted to put that back on the table. We've got a draft policy that has been attached to the report. And we've got a list of items that we believe need to be integrated into policy and or guideline. And we're hoping that we can have a conversation with council today about where those will fit. So did we just want to go through the list if that works?
Sure.
So the first one that we have is the acquisition and construction of new capitalized assets will not be eligible under the program. So in the draft bylaw policy, we have that clearly identified as being out of scope.
Go ahead.
Does that include acquisition of equipment, capital equipment, or just construction of new space?
The policy indicates acquisition of long-term assets such as land, buildings, or major pieces of equipment. So I'm going to actually take a step back first. So what staff has taken a look at is we know that we've got groups that are already under funding agreements outside of what the government transfer policy would be. We've got 3 major groups that would still fall within it, being the museum, the library, and the theater. And what we're looking to do is to provide a grandfather clause to those 3 groups, because we already have established certain parameters around how we have been funding them. So we haven't taken a look at that piece yet. In the absence of dealing with those 3 groups, we're looking at the rest of this as the policy in terms of those large pieces of equipment and capital. Now, there might be, for instance, on occasion, search and rescue would fall into this area. So there might be an occasion where search and rescue is looking for funds in terms of what they call their operating, but it might go to offset a piece of equipment. We would have to make sure we're clear about whether or not they're applying for strictly operating funds or something outside of that. So I just want to get a feel for where council is in terms of the no capital request in the policy.
I think we're going to say the same thing. So you go ahead and say it first.
How do you know? Are you in my brain?
No, but
So I'm disappointed in that this wouldn't be covering all the groups. Like
Okay.
I understand the rationale, but when I first brought this to light so many years ago, it was to find a way to be more equitable and to establish a process that any group in the community could access. So for me and the way my brain works, it would be very problematic for me to be looking at this government transfer policy outside of the three large groups.
So I would agree. I think that there's discussion to be had around the legacy, let's call them legacy groups. And we haven't flushed that out. So I think that I agree that there's a debate or a discussion to be had around that. What, from a capital perspective, and this is where I thought you might go, is there was some concern, and I know you've brought it before. Who owns this stuff later if there's some kind of a insolvency or something that happens with the small group? And for instance, the boat that was bought for the Rescue Society, right? So if the Rescue Society for some reason is defunct or can't carry on, there's a riverboat there. And so we funded it wholly or in part. So what happens with that? And I think that's similar. And so, and I think it is important to distinguish between your question, sort of what is major equipment and what is sort of stuff that you're using on a fairly regular basis. So I think the policy needs to be clear with respect to that. You know, would we fund a projector? Because I think they're really expensive, right? So would we? Because in the end, is it any good to us? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You know, is that the kind of thing you can sell later? You know, if for some reason, you know, that's whatever the capital piece is it is or is it isn't? If we have the ability, I think, to recuperate it, then I think maybe there's a possibility for us to fund part of it. If not, then it should, or if it's part of our buildings, maybe. You know, I still want to have the discussion with it because there's so many pieces to it, but I think we need to clearly identify what those pieces are
Right.
over time.
And just to expand on that a little bit, so not to pick on any one organization. So the Historical Society, when some years ago, we gave extra funding for those vehicles. that we
$90,000.
purchased.
Yeah.
Anything happens there, who do they belong to? And if, when you look at their budgets over the years, they use X amount of dollars for operating. And then almost half of that additional allotment goes towards capital. So I just feel that, I mean, and the golf course was in the same kind of situation, and we kind of changed how we've looked at the golf course. So I just feel that it's just hard for me to understand. Well, you can understand it because of the grandfathering whole thing or the historical perspective whole thing. But, you know, to say to one group, well, you can't do this, but you can do this because that's the way it's always been, like, that would be very problematic for me.
But I think it can be worked out based on the definition of capital, because then it becomes fair to everybody. Everybody knows the rules then.
Well, and I think the piece that we will be working throughout is, so when we talk about our operating grants and our in-kind donations and things like that, within the scope of this policy right now, the draft, we talk about no return of service. So we're providing funds with no expectation of any type of municipal service being returned. So if we have a municipal service, we carved those out and we have service agreements with them. I think that's what we call them.
That's right.
Service agreements with them for that purpose. What we talk about here is, so for instance, in our policy, we're talking about the recipient of an operating grant is not expected to provide anything in return or to complete any specific tasks or projects in return for our funding.
So I don't think I agree with that definition, because I think we are expecting something in return. Let's just say we are, I'll pick on the Literacy Society because I'm the chair. So let's just say the Literacy Society applies for whatever X amount of dollars, and they are going to use that for operations, which include, advocacy, the newsletter, like whatever, like they have to prove that those services have been delivered to residents of NRM.
Absolutely, and I think I'm taking us a bit off track. They're going to outline their core services for which they are looking for operating funding. And we would have, we're proposing having agreements with them, performance agreements with them, so that they understand what their obligations are in terms of delivering that project. I think about,
But the difference is they're not doing it on our behalf.
yeah,
So they have their own.
Definition of service.
Right, yeah, so they're those groups accessing funds through this program will be independent of the NRM. They have a distinct group of clientele. They've defined their own services and service levels. They've proposed to us what they intend to do with the grants that they're requesting. The agreement that we enter into them with them is we've agreed to award this amount of funds. You've agreed to deliver this scope of services. And at the end of the year, we're going to request that you report on that delivery. And that's it. We're not telling them we want them. We're not defining the service level. They have. And
We've approved based on that, which is, I think we
Yeah.
just need to change our definition of what the
Absolutely.
operating grant would be, because the way it reads now to
Mhm.
somebody that isn't part of this discussion is the Literacy Society can apply for $30,000 and there's no responsibility,
Yeah.
like there's no,
Right.
and that's.
Yeah,
Yep,
to me,
absolutely.
there's a difference between, I think the discussion we were having prior was the difference between a service that the municipality would take on and a benefit to the community. Right? We're splitting hairs there a little bit, but the Literacy Society is providing a benefit to the community with the work they're doing. I don't want to use the word service. And it's the same as the theater's providing a benefit to the community without actually being a service that we had decided that we would take on. So I think, so I
The
think if we're,
distinction.
yeah, and we're gonna do that with a benefiting agreement between us, right? Because we're gonna give them cash, they're gonna benefit the municipality somehow, or the community somehow,
And we don't own the asset,
right?
which then puts the Historical Society in that gray zone, like
Yeah.
all on their own, because we are paying, the NRM is paying for operating expenses, but we don't own that asset, or do we own that? I don't think we own that asset.
Well, if it's, sorry.
Different question or?
This is back to the original question
Oh.
of, whether or not council should be funding capital items. I'll answer that when you're done.
Yeah,
Okay, sure. In terms of operating, I don't believe that we would lay claim to their operating environment. Right, so our funds would partially fund a request for operating
Mhm.
from them.
well,
As opposed to fully fund their operation. So we want to be able to implement cost. That NRM won't be the only source of revenue. We don't want to make groups self-sufficient or totally reliant on the Northern Rockies for funding. So we want to make sure that we've got the ability, they have the ability to identify that they have other revenue streams that would also come into play.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, we wouldn't own their the paper or the pens or the monitors, for instance. In
Yeah,
that case,
from an operating, but I think from the capital
from a
perspective, I
capital
think,
perspective.
right, there's a capital. So the museum, for instance, has exhibits. So,
Mhm.
we've paid, a lot for those exhibits over the year. I think that's where
Mhm.
the gray is coming in, right? Yeah.
Okay.
And just back to the capital question, I think one thing we should keep in mind is that some of these operations depend on capital items to run their operations. Without those capital items, there's no operation to fund because they can no longer deliver the services that are dependent on the capital. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And let's say if we went back to the rec center, if we stopped funding rec center capital, how would the rec center function at that point if we were just giving them operation? I don't think it would last very long. So, you know, one nonprofit to another could be completely different, depending on their needs of services, but the capital can play a bigger part in any one of them. So I think we should just keep that in mind. And there is there was a traditional funding of capital, you know, back in the day, which had slowly changed, I think, or was reduced. And so now we're talking zero, which makes me a little bit uncomfortable because I know that if you don't have capital, the future of your operation can be in jeopardy. So.
Well, maybe the definition could be expanded to say something that, that capital won't be funded without some sort of service agreement or call it whatever,
Mhm.
which then indicates,
Yep.
like what happens if that not-for-profit becomes defunct. Because according to the Societies Act, if a not-for-profit becomes defunct, all of those assets are then sold off and the money that's generated, well, goes to pay their bills, but then the money that's generated is then donated throughout the community. So there's no provision to say if the local government contributed X amount of dollars, that that money would come back to the local government, but maybe that could help to solve that problem.
And just one more point to that is that let's say the theater example. You know, we purchased a digital projector for $120,000 in 2010. The value of that projector is less than $10,000 today. It's not of any value to anyone.
Right.
It's at the end of its life cycle. It needs to be replaced at some point. But if the theater and the municipality were to walk away from each other, that asset doesn't have much value because it's completed its life cycle. So I think that's another thing. Also, the seats were funded, and that was almost 10 years ago. And you know, if let's say the theater and the municipality walked away, I don't think there would be much of an argument as to who gets to keep those seats because
They're anchored.
they're anchored to the
Anchored into
building.
the
right?
building, yeah.
Yeah, and they were partially funded by both organizations. So
Yeah.
so yeah, maybe some definitions, but I don't think there's going to be much of an argument as to, you know, where the surplus, I don't think there would be much surplus funds at the end of the day, but yeah.
I think too, so there might be some thought around whether we're renewing assets. So like all of those examples in my mind would be renewing assets that have existed, and you're right. If they were never to be replaced, it's a short lifespan for the organization. But if we think forward and about any number of organizations who may want to access this program and have some potentially major capital requests, those come with a responsibility to the municipality. So once you commit to funding a new capital asset, if you've agreed at the outset, you're going to fund renewal. That's a long commitment because now you've opened the door to continue to invest in that, whatever it is, for a long period of time. If you create the situation where it's a NRM asset, although it's being managed and maintained by another organization, that could create headaches because now we may end up with something that costs us money when that organization no longer exists. Because if it's a structure and it's not maintained adequately over time, you're now inheriting something that you have to deal with, which we have a lot of those on our own books of our own assets. So I can appreciate that there's that desire to have recovery if the organization goes sideways, but there's a reason that organizations like NDI say, we'll give you capital funds, but it's yours to manage and yours to do with. It's basically no strings attached. So just different schools of thought, not that one way is right over the other, but just there's definitely consequences, I guess, to both sides.
Yeah, the difference between NDI and us is that the NDI would never take on the benefit or right? They would, where we might, right? We might say, well, it's unfortunate that the Because it could be lack of volunteers or people move and they just disband, but yet the service is so beneficial to the community that the council of the day may say, okay, we're gonna hire staff to operate this. So, so there's land, there's buildings, and then there's equipment. And land and buildings, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? It's the equipment bit of what's in, what's out, and I agree that if we're gonna get into some of these long-term funding situations, then the benefiting agreement starts to spell out the definition of those things. The policy could just say, we'll have a benefiting agreement that talks about capital. But then the benefiting agreements themselves would work out the details of what it looks like. Counselor Andrews.
So with the difference between capital and operations, how are we gonna prevent an organization from saying, oh, we've got to spend $1,000 capital each year. We don't have to worry about the operations. There's an opportunity to get that from the municipality. So they're just gonna shuffle their coconuts, buy their own capital and expect us to run on operation, like not expect, but kind of look for it that way. So I could see a potential loophole there. How do we manage that?
And that's exactly what most organizations are going to do, because we're going to be saying to them, we can come to the table for some of your operating funding, but we have no ability to come to you for capital. If we have the ability to have a section for capital that includes an agreement that identifies ranges for instance, in terms of incrementally how large the purchase is, and depending on that, insurance requirements, the requirement to refund any proceeds from a sale, for instance, within X number of years, those sorts of things. And as the amounts being requested could potentially get larger than that, we would want them to be investing in their own type of reserve policies.
Their asset.
Good asset management. So it would provide them with the opportunity for us to provide some guiding principles for them in terms of that renewal. It would also provide us with some assurance that that $10,000 for that piece of equipment at the theater after X number of years, we will get to a point where we would not anticipate a refund for it because it's already aged out. So we can identify in the policy that there would be consideration for capital requests, and then bridge the guidelines based on and the agreements based on those types of parameters that you would have to meet. I mean, for heaven's sakes, I don't want to put the Northern Rockies at risk by identifying that a grant is going to purchase a piece of equipment to be used by an organization in the community that we own, because our liability at that point would be in question, and ensuring the asset itself, depending on what it is. The organizations do need to have responsibility as well. So anything, how does that sound in terms of,
From a capital perspective, yeah,
capital
and it applies to
perspective?
everybody.
thank you,
I-
that.
I was gonna add, I mean, I look at the boat, for example, the riverboat you were talking about, Mayor. I think it's case by case, as long as there's acknowledgement and the policy around what capital is and the process in terms of how to deal with it on that case by case
Mhm.
situation. 'Cause it doesn't necessarily mean, because I would agree, we wouldn't want to hold the liability of it, but if anything, have the ability, and that's where that agreement would come in place, and picking the boat, if something were to happen to SARS where they became insolvent. It's already known in advance as part of the agreement when they purchased and the funds were provided. That piece of equipment would revert back to the municipality to either pass it on to someone else to use that can provide the service, or to receive funds if you were to sell it, right? I think that's that case by case piece too, that the process as part of the policy needs to kind of help flush that out. So at the time you can ask certain questions and confirm
Yeah.
all of that, tick those boxes, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
I just want to.
Don was first, yeah, please.
Just one other thing to consider is that there are lots of organizations funding capital projects for nonprofits, but they require a minimum amount, sometimes it's 50%, other times they'll fund 75%. But if you don't have that 25% in hand, you're not getting a dime from them. So
Right.
that can also further deter operations from being successful in their capital acquisitions.
Yeah.
So I think maybe a hybrid, 25% versus 75%, and you go and fundraise the rest. I wouldn't see any reason to fund 100% of any capital item. That isn't, a capital item that might not be eligible for a program or something on an emergency basis. So that's my perspective on funding.
Councilor Gruen?
Yeah, I just was thinking back to the example about the projector. Let's just say the municipality did provide funds for that projector, and then you said like 10 years later, it's worth nothing, you're right. But if that organization went under the next year or, the second year, whatever, then there's still some monetary value there. So I really liked your point about aging out, right? Have that in the agreement. So, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the second item that we are would not be eligible under the program, and that's sponsorships. So what we had identified was that sponsorships are a type of support where the supporting entity, the NRM, expects to receive promotional benefit in return. And so we're identifying that sponsorships are out, period. We're good with that?
So in that case, a couple of years ago, we sponsored the trade show. It might not have gone ahead without, you have something you want to, might not have gone ahead with, at least that was the story that was the situation that we felt might be the reality. So then that would contravene our policy.
They're also eligible now. For the waiver policy.
Right.
Show is.
And we
That
did-
was just an example, but there could be other,
We do have identify event grants for a specific event, which is often a community or of cultural importance. So there would be an opportunity to view it through that lens. Yep.
And I think
Yeah.
as a sponsorship, there is an expectation of recognition in a sponsorship. Which is a little bit, it's kind of tipping the balance of what a government transfer is, that you're providing funds with no expectation of something in return. So
Mhm.
if you're giving funds with the intent of receiving something promotional, then maybe there's a better place to look at sponsorships
Then here,
outside
Right.
of this program. So,
advertising or whatever,
yeah,
yeah.
and council has a alleged budget for special events, sponsorships, things like that. So it's just, I think being clear up front what the program is and what it isn't. And not to say sponsorships should never be entertained, but not for this program.
And just to finish off on the trade show, I think we were really because we were thinking about it when they came and asked for a bunch of money. It was a one time, we said one time, right? Because we didn't want it to become part of this overall process. So I saw your hand up. Yeah.
What about recognition of funding altogether? I know there's lots of funded organizations that are funded from their cities or municipalities, and on their websites at the bottom, they have their sponsors as well as funders. Government of BC, Arts Council. Should we have that as a provision so that we do get some recognition for our efforts?
I think so. Actually, PRRD has a sample of their sponsorship logo so that it can be included on brochures and things like that.
Yeah, that becomes part of the benefit agreement that you.
Yeah, yeah, recognition of funding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. The next one is, so just, we're clear that we've got other programs. So as Jay just said, the facility fee waiver program. We have the grant and aid program.
Yeah.
Right? So that brings up a question that Jay and I had talked about, and that is, so if you have applied for operational funding, are you eligible? We believe you're still eligible for a fee waiver. Are you still eligible for a grant and aid?
I think grant and aid, our intent is to roll grants and aid into the program. the
Into
government
this?
transfers.
Yeah.
Totally.
So when
I
we're,
didn't hear what you said. Sorry. We would intend to roll the discretionary grants and aid program into the government transfers program.
right, because we talked about funding.
Different levels.
Different levels of funding, and that would be the initial level at which would require different reporting, different expectations from that organization does. Yeah,
So
different accountabilities, that
Just
sort
for
of thing.
simplicity, we're dealing with money in the government transfers and we're dealing with fee waivers as an in-kind exchange through our facility fee waiver.
So the original question is still valid, though. If you're funded at the $30,000 level, are you still eligible for for a $1,000 level? Or have you already participated in? Right, so that's,
Or is it operating grants and you would like an event,
Wait,
event, funded in the same year?
there's a lot there. So you're, yeah,
Okay.
your turn.
Okay, so as I see it, if somebody applies for a government transfer and then needs a fee waiver, I get that could cohabitate. But if somebody applies for the government transfer program, I don't think that they should then be able to apply for a grant and aid. Because currently our grant and aid is limited at $1,000, I do believe. So yeah, I see, you apply for a bigger pot of money or you apply for the $1,000. Everybody gets to apply for the fee waiver is how I see it. Okay.
So are we saying that the grant and aid program as it is now would be absorbed into this new government transfer policy? I still see them as two separate things because one operation could be looking for operating funding for the entire organization for the entire year. And then most of the grant and aids are just one-time events separate from their operation. So how do you reconcile that you're having different organizations applying for different, I guess the different tiers would.
Seen a shift now
Okay.
with our grant and aid program. So once upon a time, we had a lot of applications under the grant and aid program for related to an event that was taking place in one of our spaces, and they applied for a grant and aid to offset the cost of the fee, the rental fee. Now that we have the fee waiver policy, people are just leveraging that because they get 4 waivers a year, so they could potentially have 4 events a year. But they're also applying for the grant and aid for the cash. So they don't have to demonstrate that they're gonna buy supplies for an event for the grant and aid. They just need to demonstrate that their annual budget is $3,000 or higher and they're eligible to receive $1,000. So we're seeing people aren't using the grant and aid program for events anymore. They're going the way of the fee waiver policy, because by and large, most events that these groups are holding are in the rec center. So, not to say, like, if they want to rent the lamp-lighters, they could absolutely ask for a grant and aid to cover off that cost, but space and other facilities in town it's not prohibitive, the cost, whereas using the community hall can be cost prohibitive. So leveraging the fee waiver program makes a ton of sense for them to do that. So just witnessing that shift in which program people are using for what purpose, it just made sense to us that we pulled the grant and aid program into the government transfers program.
Does that cover your question off?
Yeah, it does. I mean, essentially what you're doing is taking 3 programs and putting them into 2,
Yeah.
right? So that cleans things up. I think that's good.
And I think if somebody, is doing a fundraiser for something and they're applying for 30,000 or more operational, that there would be a line item in there that says revenues from that and expenses from whatever it is project that you're doing, it becomes part of your overall budget. So there's no reason then, if you're applying at the 30,000, there's no reason to apply at the $1,000 level. And if you only are applying at the 1,000, then obviously it's a smaller operation. You're just gonna do whatever you need to do with it and the reporting will be minimal. Go
So
ahead, Kyle.
Along those lines, then, if we're giving an operational grant, then are they still eligible for an event grant? With how it's,
Mostly.
so hypothetically, what I'm thinking is you've got X company, they need $15,000 a year to operate, and we've approved that all. And then all of a sudden, come April, they got an opportunity to hold an event that wasn't in their yearly budget. So they could apply for that event grant then hypothetically?
4 times a year.
No, that's
Fee
the
waiver,
fee waiver.
fee-
Sorry,
oh,
yeah.
oh,
So
I'm
these are
sorry.
two
Oh.
different grants
Okay.
under the same window.
Then I would say no.
Right, and so that's where I,
I'd say no. They've already been funded at the higher level, higher tier, and so they can't go back to the lower tier asking for more.
well, okay, and just the way I was thinking it is like, we're operating, the company X is able to operate. Now there's an opportunity for them to hold an event in our community, but they can't come and get funding from us for it. They got to try to do it elsewhere.
But to clarify, if that event is taking place in a municipal facility like the rec center, they can apply for a fee waiver.
Right.
And continue that event and then, okay, good.
So what if my organization needs operating funding? And I plan on hosting an event this year that we don't normally host. Can I apply for operating grant and an event grant at the same time?
I'd say no, you should be able to include it in your original operational grant.
Okay.
If you're, I mean,
Yeah.
the exception is it comes up in the middle of the year that there's a great opportunity and, that's a tough one to try to deal with in advance, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so that also plays into, the grant need is open to 4 times a year windows. When I first envisioned this policy a few years back, it was an annual application. And that it was well-known throughout the community. Here are the pots of money that you may be able to, may be successful in applying for. Here are the deadlines. That we could have 2 separate sets of deadlines within the policy.
Each
Or
tier, each
I-
tier actually could have its own deadlines or groups, intakes.
Yeah, I mean,
Or the smaller it is, the more intakes you potentially can have,
yeah.
because
so-
it's easier to budget for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the ones that have a significant ask that. For our purposes for budgeting, I think you need to know well in advance. But you're right, you might have something that comes up unexpectedly or a need arises in the community and the group wants to respond and it's a $2,000 request. And so that's a little easier to manage on a quarterly basis than, your $50,000.
Well,
ask.
The grant and aid program is a pot of funds that's budgeted as part of the budgeting process, and you chip away at it throughout the year,
Yeah.
the way it is today, right?
Yeah.
Where the larger operating grants are part of the budget process itself.
Yeah.
Like they're separate, which is that tier piece.
Yeah, but once we roll them all together, there needs to be an understanding for the folks how often.
Think what they can do and what.
Yeah, what the intakes
Yeah.
are for those, yeah.
And it might be that you budget a lump sum and we manage a portion of that as that kind of discretionary small category of funding. And then the larger piece is your annual requests and as
Yeah.
council decides to award that. And then it was also just around, obviously council holds the discretion, the decision-making authority at the end of the day, but is it, it's there till it's not, or how do we manage that pool of funds essentially annually?
Yeah, that smaller amount just ends up becoming like you say, a pot that you have a certain amount of intakes to and either when it's gone, or you come back to council or something, and because it's a small pool, right? So likely can be easy to add to from reserves or something like that, if the council of the day feels they want to bump it up. Because there's so much activity in the community, because that would be the result, right? Lots of activity.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would like some clarifications. If we aren't sponsoring events, but we are funding events, what is the distinction between those two things? And almost the means to the end is almost the same. So how do we draw the line between a sponsorship and an actual funding of an event?
in my mind, when you sponsor an event, you have, you know, the premier sponsor has banners and program logos and garments, and it begs whether the funding provided is being put where it needs to, because now there's all these other promotional pieces that are expected to be attached, whereas there's lots of events that NRM has funded through existing programs that we haven't had our names plastered all over everything. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but that's never been the intention of those programs, is to receive any promotional benefit. It's been to ensure that they're successful in the community. So I think, yeah, it's just around expectations, and then essentially what we hope to achieve through the program. Because there's a huge cost. I mean, yes, it's great to sponsor things, but there's a huge cost to deliver on the expectation that you're doing that for a promotional purpose.
And you're also talking about sponsoring an event,
Yeah,
but we're not gonna sponsor baseball teams or hockey teams or any of that stuff either as part of it, right? So that whole sponsorship is a bigger sort of a thing than just events.
Yeah.
But if an organization puts an event into their operational budget, shows revenues, shows expenses, then we're not expecting our name on it anymore. That's their event that we've funded them as a group. That's their event within their yearly funding. So that's how we stay away from the sponsorship, if they can plan ahead well enough to get it into their own budget. Yeah.
So that leads into the next few notes that we have here. One is that we would not be the funder of last resort. We don't intend to be the sole funder for any organization to maintain their programs. And then along with that, we know in our discretionary grant and aid program, we're talking about a 30%. So funding ought not exceed X% of other revenues. So it's about, we want to understand what's an acceptable funding level as a percentage of that request. Are we, it can be tiered, certainly. It can be a bracket. I don't like brackets because they're too subjective. But if it's 30% for items, requests of $1,000, we won't make up any more than 30% of it. If it's $100,000 request, is there a limit to what we would be providing?
So my initial thought is the tiered approach.
Okay.
That each tier has its expected maximum
Funding
level, funding level that then gets put into an agreement between the, within that then tier, that single tier, there'll be funding agreements that go in there, but the tier itself would have a maximum amount. I don't know what that is. I mean, I think the larger you go, the bigger it is, right? Because the larger it is, if we talk about the legacy groups, there's a big benefit to the community. And so where there's a big benefit to and that's even subjective. That's even subjective, using the word big. But I guess what I'm trying to say badly is that the bigger it is, the bigger the percentage would be, because the bigger it is, it's usually providing, a pretty significant, I don't want to use the word service, but, a benefit to the community, although each of these provide benefit to the community. So, yeah, go ahead.
So this is where it's really hard to digest this, because when you look at our legacy groups, we take the library and we'll take the Historical Society. So yes, the library has some alternative sources of funding, but they're very small in comparison to what the municipality supplies. And the Historical Society, Kim will correct me after this meeting. I'm surprised she hasn't texted me yet. She must not be watching. I think that the municipality is the greatest financial supporter of that organization. So coming up with this number when you're looking at those two legacy groups is extremely difficult. If I were to put those, well, and the Phoenix Theater as well, anyways, yeah. Put those three groups aside, then for me, it's easier to go, oh yeah, that makes total sense. But then you go back to what I said at the beginning, it's not equitable. Why is it gonna be this way for this group, but not for these three groups? So that's my struggle.
I think maybe it's a thought around. As we describe those legacy groups, have some context around how they came to be. So a lot of at least the theater and the museum came to be as a result of a public process. And potentially the same for the library. I can't remember the history closely enough, but recognizing that they weren't the advent of just a small group of impassioned individuals. They resulted because of a public process of the day, whatever that was, whether it was a service area establishment, whether it was a referenda, whatever that looked like, but the whole public was involved in confirming that it was worthwhile to fund and support the establishment of those organizations. So I totally appreciate the equity, but I wonder if there's an opportunity to kind of have that context to describe why they may be treated differently than new coming organizations. Because you do have to think, how do you evaluate the benefit to the community or the value to the, it's qualitative and it's very hard to say, yes, we're prepared to give you 60% of your annual funding because what you're doing is of value, because it's gonna be, every group thinks they're bringing huge value.
Yeah, that's right. But there might be some precedent for this, though. You might be able to look to the Peace River Regional District. They can fund to a certain amount for so many years, and then there's an expectation of a referendum. And it could be over a certain amount of dollars. So perhaps the tiered approach, before we'll accept somebody else into the highest tier, there's got to be a public process. That potentially becomes how you get into that highest tier, which then starts to tell all kinds of things, right? Because now the public is saying, yes, that's a service or that's a benefit to the community that we're prepared to pay whatever into because you've gone through the public process. Go ahead.
I think that's a very good point. And one example would be the theater. The theater was opened with the expectation that it would balance its own budget. It had a budget originally of $20,000 revenues and $20,000 expenditures, not a dime for staff. And 4 years later, there was a decision the community had to make. The theater closes its doors or it's funded through the tax base, and 75% of people voted. So I kind of like that. You get started, you see how things go, and then if there's a real drive for the community to retain that service, then it's up to the community themselves. I kind of like that. But as far as a percentage of your budget, I think that to put a quantitative number on that is going to be difficult, because if you did that to the library, if you return a book late, you're going to be paying $2,500 for that late fee.
Yeah, right.
Another example for the theater, just because I know a little bit about it, our budget was traditionally about 35%. The municipality represented 35% of that budget. Now it's well over 50%, possibly even 60%. And we've reduced staff. We've put in some initiatives to raise more funds, but at the end of the day, we don't really have control of that number. And originally we were told, ask for what you need. And that's a different thing than saying, okay, well, ask for 30%.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we'll have to maybe have some more thought.
Well,
on that.
it becomes a matter of, once you open something, there's so many more groups that might come in at higher funding levels or expectations that you start to run into the maximum amount that you can distribute in the community. And so now, now we as a group, all of us staff, and have to try to figure out, how do you split up a maxed amount, right? Because you've set a certain amount and now you're completely subscribed. Now, NDIT's in this boat, right? There's so much money that we can give every year, and we've been really lucky in the Northeast in that we haven't been oversubscribed, but we're getting close. And so decisions have to be made then at that point of who gets what and how does that work? And, we could be coming to that day as the tax base in this community starts to get smaller, And the expectations through policies like this start getting bigger. Someday there's gonna be a tough choice to make, but at least if we're talking about it, people will understand, talking about it now rather than when it happens, right? Go ahead.
And I totally understand what you're saying, Counselor Roper, about that percentage thing. So I totally get that. But what I'm thinking about right now is what happened to the Phoenix Theater. You know, like, because there was somebody that took exception to the Phoenix Theater, and then all of a sudden it goes from being supported to not being supported for X amount of years. And that's one of the drivers for me for this policy as well, is it's got to be fair and equitable. I know that that's easy to say and harder to do,
Mm.
but so that percentage might be the way to do that, right? Because it has to be the same for everybody. Otherwise, I think we're opening ourselves up to what happened before.
There's another angle at this too, is the ability for that group to actually, and I guess this is the library example, the ability of that group to actually generate incomes of their own. Right? So our theater has the ability to generate income. It's a business decision as to how they go about doing that, what your ticket prices are, et cetera, et cetera. But they do have the ability. The golf course has the ability, the visitor information center has the ability, yeah, so all these groups have the ability to generate cash from the public somehow, and so there might be an angle at that helps with deciding this as well, so. It may fit, I'm not sure, but I think the ability to generate your own revenues
Well, that's
comes
a really
into
good
this
point,
somehow.
yeah. And is it being maximized? Unfortunately, fortunately, the public library isn't allowed to charge for
Right,
any of
right.
its services, but there are lots of libraries that have friends of the library that can do
Mhm.
fundraising and, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff too. So.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just about fundraising and corporate sponsorships,
Mhm.
the community right now is very tapped out.
Yeah.
There are a lot of hats going out and, yeah, I fear right now for the nonprofits in this community.
Yeah.
Things have gotten so bad. Our numbers at the theater, just one example, we're down 3/4 of our business from 12, 13 years ago. And that's a substantial amount of revenue that's
Yeah.
down. And what would happen to the golf course if we, commit a certain amount of funds and then it rains for 2 months and then they can't generate those regular revenues. So
Yeah.
there's so many moving parts at play. It's just, yeah.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the pieces that we want to speak about integrating in. We acknowledge that we would want all groups to enter into an agreement as well. And the development of a program guide and the procedures will be instrumental to being able to roll this out successfully. So we recognize that. Given that, we've identified some key, pardon me, is there anything else that you have maybe thought about that you would like to see or like us to cover? Anything that we haven't covered already within the policy itself?
Yeah, I think the program guide and procedure, there's a lot to be flushed out there, right?
Yeah,
There's the
absolutely.
tier levels, there's the accountability levels within those tiers, the reporting levels within those tiers, the application process within those tiers. There's a lot of devil in those details. And, obviously the smaller it is, the less I would expect, the less you would expect for application, reporting,
Yes.
all of that. The bigger it gets, obviously, I believe that the bigger ones, you might even go to the point of asking for an audit, right? We may have to, it's expensive, we might have to pay for that, but if, it becomes part of the tier is that we're gonna give $6,000 or $10,000 towards an audit every year, every other, whatever we decide, but there's those accounting expectations
Yeah.
would go in there. So all of those are gonna be different in the different tiers. Go ahead.
One consideration might be, I mean, we are endeavoring to not have control over these groups. So we don't want to say you're going to charge this much for your tickets or this much for your books or blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And on the other hand, we have the ability to say, okay, you've asked for this much, but we're only going to give you this much. And so that actually dictates what they have to charge, what they have to do with their staff and other things. So there might be a need for some sort of dispute process or further consideration if, let's say, you know, if someone asks for 50 and we say, okay, well, you get 25. Maybe they won't take the 25 because if they don't get the 50, they can't run. So I think there's got to be some sort of process in place for that kind of dispute if it arises. Hopefully it doesn't, but there's always that potential.
And where, maybe that's to come yet, but we're in here that we need, like, we're not funding any political things, like all of the things that. that we're-
Eligibility.
Yeah, eligibility, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe some clarification. I know on the application for the nonprofits, it says, you know, cannot buy alcohol. Well, some of the nonprofits are buying alcohol to sell, not for themselves, not to drink, but to sell to customers. So maybe some clarification on that as well.
On those as well. Currently, our application that we do have that has gone out the last few years asks organizations to tell us if we can't fund your full request, what are your, you know, what are the consequences?
Mm.
So that certainly is something that we'll be able to keep in mind. So given that, we've put together some very optimistic deadlines. So we're looking at bringing forward May 12th, the draft policy for your review. And then by the 1st of June, we want to be able to present what the application and guide package would look like. And following very closely, once we have approval on that, with a communication plan out to the community by the middle of June. We need to make sure that we give organizations a lot of time to understand that there are changes, but new organizations time to understand that there may be opportunities. So it's a fairly tight timeline. Fortunately, when I worked on this project back in 2022, I had some of the tiered eligibilities and requirements and things like that we'll go back to be able to pull into those guidelines. And then the last piece we wanted to have a chat about is there a desire to identify a pot of money? So a lot of municipalities identify an arbitrary pot of money. They may tie it to another number they already have. So for instance, in the report, we have used our departmental operating expenses. We can pick any number. We can pick tax levy from last year. We can pick whatever it is, and then apply a percentage to that in terms of here's the envelope of money that we would have in our next budget year to fund all of the project requests that we get. So is there, first of all, a desire to do something like that? And if there is, any suggestions on parameters?
With
For me, I would rather get the requests to inform what that pot of money would be rather than come up with one maybe not so informed and then go to them. I think that would that could potentially reduce any conflicts with any of the requests that we receive, because it should be, you know, ask for what you need, no more, but no less. So.
ditto for me, you know, I want to see what comes forward when this policy is, just to see what the expectations might be out there. And whether we can even come close to potentially funding what it looks like. That will inform our decision, I think, with respect to how much do we need? And what does it then become a percentage of this, you know, or I like the idea of setting an amount. Because at some point you have to justify that amount to the taxpayer out there and yeah. If it becomes this percentage of whatever it is, then that's what it is that we use, and then everybody knows that that's what it is, and And if the applications come in way over that, people will realize that we've got to make some hard decisions. Everybody, us as well as the folks that are applying. Because there's only so much to go around.
Did I hear you say two things? Did I hear
No.
you say, sorry, I thought I heard you say that you wanted to wait to see what the applications would be. But then I thought I heard you say you like the idea of a set amount. So
Gen-
could
yeah,
you just
So,
confirm?
yeah, so generally I like the idea of a set amount, but not before we're informed by this new policy,
Okay,
right?
Okay.
So I like the idea of 5% of revenues, say. You know, I just picked that out of the air. 5% of revenues, let's say it represents $1 million. That's what it will become over time. But I don't know that $1 million is, once we roll this out, there are gonna be people who start applying for these things. And I don't know if the expectations from all the nonprofits in the community are gonna add up to 2 million in that first year.
so can I? Is it
Yeah.
okay? So I kind of like the idea of having a set amount. Because I think we could have a general idea based on historically what we've paid out in the past. Because for me, without a set amount, how do we make a decision? So let's just say that we decide it's going to be $1 million, just pretend it's going to be $1 million, but the applications come in at $2 million. So what are we going to do? Like without saying to the public, we are prepared this tax year to pay out X amount of dollars. How do we then make a decision on who gets what funding if we don't have the bar set is how I'm thinking about it.
Are there community groups out there that haven't been applying who will apply? Those are the ones I'm afraid of. Not that I'm afraid, but those are the ones I don't understand. That's a value of pot of money there that I don't understand right now. Senior Society, for instance, maybe. I mean, they're not in our,
Yeah, we give them 20,000.
oh yeah, okay, but it's not,
Yeah.
right? Okay, yeah. So it's, who else is out there that might come forward and ask for money that, hey, that aren't there now?
So I'm stuck in the middle
Yeah.
because I would like to have a parameter set, but also I don't know where to set that parameter. That's why it would be nice to be able to have maybe a year or two of these intakes. But we're gonna run into the problem where we're gonna have to eventually, like, I'm guessing this year. Like, so I think it would be easier for me, we look at our budget. What are we over last year? Okay, well, are we willing to go up a little bit more? Like making agreements around this table, we might say $1 million. Look at our budget, look at where everything's sitting. And then when this intake comes in, yeah, we'll have to make that hard decision. And then maybe next year we got to raise it or lower it. But I think we need a parameter to start with.
Well,
Right. And I don't know where to set it. And that's where I think we just need to agree as a group here.
So may I?
no,
Are-
please, sorry, I'm just,
That's okay, yeah.
go ahead.
Are we
I'm just looking at our
thinking
budget this year.
Are we thinking about putting this in effect for this budget year? Like, no, right?
No.
No.
Because we got our budget. So we are looking for budget season of 2026.
Correct.
So we have time to kind of continue these discussions, and then make appropriate decisions. We already know what organizations are in our community. We don't know which ones could be formed because of this opportunity, but I think we could come up with an educated guess as to what organizations could be interested. And then depending on what we set that percentage of, right? Like we're only gonna fund 30% of it, whatever that number happens to be. I think like that's gonna be a hard discussion
Yeah.
piece too, right? So I just am cautioning us not to try to make too many kind of decisions today. I think
Yeah.
we still got lots of more discussion around certain aspects of this. And then just to confirm it's not happening this year, it's for next year.
Yeah.
The reason we asked the question around the budget was because we weren't certain what council's level of urgency was.
Yeah.
So we are proposing that we can have the program complete by mid-year. So if there was an intent that it be implemented then potentially you could, if there was a budget allocated, you could receive applications.
Yeah.
But right now, today, we're at the approval of the budget. if we put the program into effect in June, we would have $20,000 to award through the program, because that's all we've budgeted so far as our grant and aid budget. But, and as long as we're clear about that, that's the capacity, that would be the funding available to fund this program from June to December.
Yeah, that's grant and aid money.
That's grant and aid
But
money,
the-
correct?
Yeah, but the groups of community or sorry, the grants to community organizations is still in this year's
That's
budget.
embedded.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
With
embedded
what we
already and
paid.
that sits at $1 million now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
But
see.
that's not the three, that's the three and all the others that we're funding at bits and pieces. Yeah, that's, hundreds, yeah, it's that's the number I
Exactly.
expect to get bigger,
Exactly.
right? And we don't know what that number is gonna look like right now, but because people within that may be expecting more as well, and then others who haven't. So, yeah, so well, yeah, I
But-
agree, we don't have to make a decision today.
Okay, good. I mean,
Right.
it's a committee of the whole, but,
Yeah,
and that, I mean, I think that's something we need to talk to our legacy groups about too, because if we are actually contemplating, we are only gonna fund 70% or pick the number, I don't
Yeah.
know, whatever it is, that could impact those groups. I would like to have a better understanding of what that impact could be before I would try to, pick a number.
Yeah. So absolutely, I wouldn't request that the process begin before funding it before the first of 2026.
Hmm.
I think we need to lay the groundwork. We need to have those communications. We need to be able to see who's out there that might be interested. We need to have a good two-way communication with potential applicants so that everyone understands what
Mm.
the parameters are around it. Once we have the guidelines, the policy and the guidelines, I'm certain.
I agree, once you figure out what the tiers will be,
Mhm.
you can pretty much figure out anybody else who might go into that next tier. And, and if it's the major tier and it's a referendum required, and then there's all kinds of expectations there you can put out there in the referendum process, which then helps you to determine it ultimately in the end. Yeah. It's that mid-range, right? The 10,000 to 150,000, and I'm just pulling those numbers out of the air. It's that mid-range that potentially is a difficult one to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And in terms of our budget for 2025, the outside of the three legacy groups, we've gone from $90,000 of requests to about 175,000.
Yeah.
So but we understand the economic impact to the organizations.
Yeah.
So
Not just.
It's almost doubled. Okay, it's 1:07. Are we good? Have you got some,
Thank you very much.
good? Okay, then we are adjourned. Thank you.